Good evening, and welcome to Tales and Cocktails, and to part 5 of Josephine Tey's BRAT FARRAR. Oh dear, there's that trying to connect thing again. Anyway, we'll just plunge in. It was a beautiful day, the day BRAT FARRAR came to Latchet's, but a restless little wind kept turning the leaves over, so that in spite of the sunlight and the bright air, the world was filled with a vague unease and a promise of storm. Much too shiny, thought Bee, looking at the landscape from her bedroom window after breakfast. Tears before night, as Nanny used to say of two exuberant children. However, at least he will arrive in sunshine. She had been greatly exercised in her mind over that arrival. It was to be as informal as possible. That was a thing that was agreed to by all concerned. Someone would meet him at the station and bring him home, and there would be luncheon with only the family present. The question was, who was to meet him? The twins had held that the whole family should go to the station, but that, of course, was not to be thought of. The prodigal could hardly be welcomed publicly on the platform at Guestgate, casual travellers between Westover and Burrs. She herself could not go without giving the returning Patrick an air of being her protégé, which was something to be avoided at all costs. She had not forgotten Simon's sneer about her adoption of Patrick. Simon, the obvious choice for the role of welcomer, was not available. Since her announcement on Sunday, he had slept at home, but had not otherwise taken part in Latchet's activities. Late on Monday night had been futile. So she had been relieved when Eleanor offered to drive the 4 miles to the station at Guestgate and bring Patrick back. The present load on her mind was that family meal after his arrival. If Simon did not turn up, how was his absence to be explained? And if he did turn up, what was that lunch going to be like? She turned to go down for one more rehearsal with the cook, their third cook in the last 12 months. When she was waylaid by Lana, their help. Lana came from the village, nails, and the local version of the current makeup. She obliged only because her boyfriend worked in the stables. She would sweep and dust, she explained when she first came, because that was all right. But she would not wait at table, because that was menial. Bee had longed to tell her that no one with her hands or her breath or her scent or her manners would ever be allowed to hand an Ashby a plate. But she had learned there was, in any case, no question of waiting at table. The Ashbys always waited on themselves. Lana had come to say that the vacuum was vomiting instead of swallowing, and domestic worries closed over once more over Bee's head and swamped domestic drama. She came to the surface in time to see Eleanor getting into her little 2-seater. "Aren't you taking the car?" she asked. The car was the family vehicle, Eleanor's disreputable little conveyance being known as the Bug. "No, he'll have to take us as we are." Bee noticed that she had not bothered to change into a dress. She was wearing the breeches and gaiters in which she had begun the morning. "Oh, take me," Ruth said, precipitating herself down the steps and onto the car, but taking good care, Bee noticed, to keep her blue away from the Bug's dusty metal. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm sure he would like me to be there. One of my generation, I mean. After all, he knows you. It won't be exciting for him to see you the way it would be if you don't want that dazzling outfit of yours to be mucked up." I do think it is selfish of Eleanor, Ruth said, dusting her palms as she watched the car grow small between the lime trees. She just wants to keep the excitement to herself. Nonsense. It was arranged that you and Jane should wait here. Where is Jane, by the way? In the stables, I think. She isn't interested in Patrick. I hope she comes in good time for lunch. Oh, she will. She may not be meals. Is Simon going to be there at lunch? I hope so. What do you think he will say to Patrick? If the peace and happiness of Latchets was going to break down into a welter of discord, the twins must go away to school. They would be going to school in a year or two anyhow. They had much better go now than live in an atmosphere of strain and hatred. Do you think, hopefully? Of course not, Ruth. I wish you wouldn't dramatize things. But she wished, too, that she could count on there being no scene. And Eleanor, on her way to the station, was wishing the same thing. She was a little nervous of meeting this new brother and annoyed with herself for being nervous. Her everyday clothes were her protest against her own excitement, a pretense that nothing of real moment was about to happen. Guestgate, which served 3 villages but no town, was a small wayside station with a fairly heavy goods business, but little passenger traffic, so that when Brat climbed down from his carriage, there was no one on the platform but a fat ticket collector and Eleanor. "Hello," she said. "You are very like Simon." And she shook hands with him. He noticed that she wore no makeup. A little powdering of freckles went across the bridge of her nose. "Eleanor," he said, identifying her. "Yes." "What about your luggage? I have just the small car, but the dicky holds quite a lot." "I just have this." "Is it coming later?" "No, this is all I possess." "Oh," she smiled just a little. "No moss." "No," he said, "no moss," and began to like her very much. "The car is out in the yard, through this way." "Been away, Mr. Ashby?" the ticket collector said, accepting his piece of pasteboard. "Yes, I've been away." At the sound of his voice, the ticket collector looked up, puzzled. "He took you for Simon," Eleanor said as they got into the car, and smiled properly. Her 2 front teeth crossed just a little, which gave her face a cool, determined, small face when she was serious. "You couldn't have come home at a better time of the year," she said, as they scrunched over the gravel of the station yard and fled away into the landscape. Home, he thought. Her hair was the color of corn, that is wheat, so ripe that it was nearly white. Pale, silky stuff, very fine. It was brushed back into a knot, as if she could not be bothered to do anything else with it. The blossom was just the knees and their worn whipcorn were just like a boy's. But the bare arms protruding from the jacket she wore, slung over her shoulders, were delicately round. "Honey has a filly foal that is going to make history. Wait till you see it. Well, you won't know Honey, of course. She was after your time. Her real name is Greek Honey, by Hymettus, out of a mare called Money for Jam. I hope you will be impressed with our horses." "I expect to be," he said. "Aunt Bee says that you are still interested in them. Horses, I mean." "I haven't done much on the breeding side, of course, just preparing horses for work." They came to the village. So this was Claire. This warm, living, flat squares on the map had stood for. There was the White Hart. There was the bell. And up there behind on its knoll was the church where the Ashby tablets hung. The village is looking nice, isn't it? Eleanor said. Not changed a bit since I can remember. Not changed since the flood, if it comes to that. The names of the people in the houses come in the same order down the street as they did in the time of Richard II. But of course you know that. I keep thinking of you as a visitor. Beyond the village, he knew, were the great gates of Clare Park. He waited, mildly curious, to see the entrance to what had been Alec Loading's home. It proved to be a sweeping curve of iron lace, flanked by a lion passant. Astride the father lion was a small boy clad in a leopard skin rug, a small boy clad in a leopard skin rug with green baize edging. A seaside pail worn helmet-wise, and nothing else that was visible. A very long brass poker stood up lance-wise from its rest on his bare foot. It's all right. That comforts me quite a bit. Did you know that Clare was a school nowadays? He had nearly said yes when he remembered that this was merely one of the things Loading had told him, not one of the things that he was supposed to know. What kind of school? A school for dodgers. Dodgers? Yes. Anyone who loathes hard work and has a parent with enough money to pay the fees makes a beeline for Clare. No one is forced to learn anything at Clare, not even the multiplication table. The theory is that one day you will feel the need of the multiplication table and be seized with a mad desire to acquire the 9 times. Of course, doesn't it? Of course not. No one who could get out of the 9 times would ever dream of acquiring it voluntarily. And if they don't do lessons, what do they do all day? Express their personalities. They draw things, or make things, or whitewash the coach house, or dress up like Anthony Tresselli. That was Tony on the Lion. I teach some of them to ride. They like that, riding, I mean. I think they are so bored with easy things that they find something a little difficult simply fascinating. Of the ordinary. The difficult thing, I mean, if it was a difficulty that everyone was supposed to overcome, they wouldn't be interested. That would bring them down to the common level of you and me. They wouldn't be different any longer. Nice people. Very profitable to Latchets anyhow. And here is Latchets. Brat's heart rose up into his throat, way between the limes. It was just as well that she was going slowly, for she had no sooner entered the green tunnel than something like a giant blue butterfly shot out from the boles of the trees and danced wildly in front of the car. Eleanor braked and swore simultaneously. "Hello, hello," shouted the butterfly, dancing to Brat's side of the car. "You ought to be killed. Don't you know that a driver doesn't see well coming into the avenue out of the sunlight? Hello, Patrick. It's me, Ruth. How do you do? I came to ride up with you. To the house, you know. Can I sit on your knee? There isn't very much room in that awful old car of Eleanor's, and I don't want to crush my dress. I hope you like my dress. It is put on specially for your coming home. You're very good looking, aren't you? Am I what you expected?" She waited for an answer to that, so that Brat said that he hadn't really thought about it. "Oh," said Ruth. "Much," she said reprovingly. "No one has talked about anything else for days." "Ah, well," Brat said, "when you have run away for years and years, people will talk about you." "I shouldn't dream of doing anything so outré," Ruth said, unforgiving. "Where did you get that word?" Eleanor asked. "It is a very good word. Mrs. Peck uses it." Brat felt that he ought to paint in a little local colour, but he had no mind to spare for artifice. He was waiting for the moment when the lines would thin out and he would see Latchets. For the moment when he would be face to face with his twin. "Simon hasn't come back yet," he heard Ruth say, and saw her sideways glance at Eleanor. The glance, even more than the information, shook him. So Simon wasn't waiting on the doorstep for him. Simon was away somewhere. Alec Loden had disabused him of the idea that a feudal staff reception would await him at Latchet's, that there would be a line of servants headed by the butler and descending in strict order to the latest tweenie to welcome the young master to the ancestral home. That, Loden had said, had gone up with bustles, and Latchet's had never had a butler anyhow. And he had known, too, that there would be no array of relations. The children's father had been an only son with one sister, Aunt Bee. The children's mother had been an only daughter with 2 brothers, both of them killed by the Germans before they were 20. The only near Ashby relation was Great-Uncle Charles, reported by Loden to be now nearing, but it had not occurred to him that all the available Ashbys might not be there, that there might be dissenters. The ease of his meeting with Eleanor had fooled him. Metaphorically speaking, he picked up the reins that had been lying on his neck. The car ran out of the thin spring green of the avenue into the wide sweep in front of the house, and there in the too bright, gusty sunlight stood Latchet's, very quiet, very friendly, very sure of itself. The gabled front of the original building had been altered by some 18th century Ashby to conform with the times, so that only the tiled roof showed its age and origin. It was now blandly Queen Anne. It stood there in its grasslands, undecorated and sufficient, needing no garden for its enhancement. The green of the small park flowered at its heart into the house itself, and any other flowering would have been redundant. As Eleanor swept round toward the house, Brat saw Beatrice Ashby come out on the doorstep, and a sudden panic seized him. A mad desire to blurt out the truth to her and back out, there and then, before he had put foot over the doorstep, before he was definitely on in the scene. It was going to be a damnably difficult and awkward scene, and he had no idea how to play it. Awkwardness. Before the car had come to a halt, she was piping her triumph to the world, so that Brat's arrival somehow took second place to her own achievement. "I met him after all, Aunt Bee. I met him after all. I came up from the gate with him. You don't mind, do you? I just strolled down as far as the gate, and when I got there, I saw them coming, and they stopped and gave me a lift, and here we are. And so I met him after all." She linked her arm through Brat's and tumbled with him out of the car, dragging him behind her, so that it was with a mutual shrug for this display of personality that Brat and Bee greeted each other. They were united for the moment in a rueful amusement, and by the time the amusement had passed, so had the moment. Before awkwardness could come flooding back, there was a second distraction. Jane came riding round the corner of the house on 4-poster on her way to the stables. The instant check of her hands on the reins when she saw the group at the door made it obvious that she had not planned on being one of that group. But it was too late now to back out. It was never possible to back away from anything that 4-poster might happen to be interested in. He had no mouth and an insatiable curiosity. So forward came the reluctant Jane on a highly interested pony. As Four-Poster came to a halt, she slid politely to the ground and stood there, shy and defensive. When Bee introduced her, she laid a small, limp hand in Brat's, and after a moment withdrew it. "What is your pony's name?" Brat asked, aware of her antagonism. "That's Four-Poster," Ruth said, appropriating Jane's mount. "The rector calls him the equine omnibus," to the pony, who refused the advance by withdrawing a pace and looking contemptuously down his Roman nose. As a gesture, it was pure burlesque, a Victorian gesture of repudiation from a Victorian drama. "A comedian," remarked Brat, and Bee, delighted with his perception, laughed. "He doesn't like people," Jane said, half repressive, half defending her friend. But Brat kept his hand out, and presently Four-Poster's curiosity overcame his standoffishness, and he dropped his head to the waiting man, and Four-Poster capitulated entirely and nuzzled him with elephantine playfulness. "Well," said Ruth, watching, "he never does that to anyone." Brat looked down into the small, tight face by his elbow, at the small, grubby hands clutching the reins so tightly. "I expect he does to Jane when no one is around," he said. "Jane, it is time you were cleaned up for lunch," Bee said, and turned to lead the way indoors. And Brat followed her over the threshold. "I have put you in. I hope you don't mind. Simon has the room that you used to share with him." "Oh dear, what a gaffe," she thought. "Shall I ever be able to think of him as Patrick? And to give you one of the spare rooms was to treat you like a visitor." Brat said that he would be glad to have the night nursery. "Will you go up now, or will you have a drink first?" "I'll go up now," Brat said, and turned to the stairway. He knew that she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the moment when he must show knowledge of the house. So he turned from her and led the way upstairs, up to the big first landing, and down the narrow corridor to the north wing, and to the children's rooms facing west from 4 doors, and stood in the room that Nora Ashby had arranged for her children when they were small. One window looked west over the paddocks, and the other north to the rise of the down. It was on the quiet side of the house, away from the stables and the approach from the road. He stood at the window looking at the soft blue English distances, thinking of the brilliant mountains beyond the swirling dust of the west, and very conscious of Bee Ashby behind him. Must take the initiative about. "Where is Simon?" he said, and turned to face her. "He is like Jane," she said, "late for lunch, but he'll be in at any moment." It was smoothly done, but he had seen her shy at his unheralded question, as if he had flicked a whip. Simon had not come to meet him. Simon, it was to be deduced, was being difficult. Before he could pursue the subject, she took the initiative from him. "You can have the nursery bathroom all to yourself, but do go slow on the hot water, will you? Fuel is a dreadful problem. Now wash and come down at once. The Pecks sent over some of the rectory sherry." "Aren't they coming to lunch?" "No, they're coming to dinner tonight. Lunch is for family only." She watched him turn to the 4th door, which he knew to be the bedroom of the nursery wing, and went away looking comforted. He'd known his way about the house, and he felt guilty and ill at ease. Fooling Mr. Sandal with a KC sitting opposite you and gimleting holes in you with cynical Irish eyes had been one thing. Fooling Mr. Sandal had been fun. But fooling B. Ashby was another thing altogether. He washed absent-mindedly, turning the soap in his hands, with his eyes on the line of the down. There was the turf he had wanted to ride on, the turf he had sold his soul for. Presently he would get quiet, away from human relationships and this fantastic game of human poker. And up there, it would once more seem right and worthwhile. He went back to his room and found a brassy blonde in tight-flowered rayon tweaking the wallflower in the bowl of the windowsill. "Hello," said the blonde. "Welcome home and all that." "Thanks," Brat said. Was this someone that he should know? Surely not. "You're very like your brother, aren't you?" "I suppose so." He took his brushes from his grip and put them on the monocle, taking possession. "You won't know me, of course. I'm Lana Adams from the village. Adams the joiner was my father. I oblige because my boyfriend works in the stables." So that was what she was, the help. He looked at her and was sorry for the boyfriend. "You look a lot older than your brother, don't you?" "I suppose it's knocking about the world that does it, having to look out for yourself and all that. Not being spoiled like your brother. You'll excuse me saying it, but spoiled he is. That's why he's made all this to-do about you coming back. Silly, I call it. You've only to look at you to know that you're an Ashby. Not much point in you take my tip and stand up to him. He can't stand being stood up to. Been humored all his life, I should say. Don't let it get you down." As Brat went silently on with his unpacking, she paused, and before she could resume, Eleanor's cool voice said from the doorway, "Have you everything you want?" The blonde said hastily, "I was just welcoming Mr. Patrick back," and having flung Brat a radiant smile, made a hip-swing exit from the room. Brat wondered how much Eleanor had heard. "It's a nice room, this," Eleanor said, "except that it doesn't get the morning sun. That bed is from Clare Park. Aunt Bee sold the little ones. It's nice, isn't it? It was the one in Alec Lettingham's room. Except for that, the room is just the same. Yes, the old wallpaper, I notice. Robinson Crusoe and Company. Yes, I had a great weakness for Hereford the Wake. He had such an enchanting profile." She pointed to Hereford's place in the pattern of fictional heroes that Nora had chosen for her children's nightly entertainment. "Is the nursery rhyme paper still next door?" "Yes, of course. Come and see." He went with her, but while she rehearsed the pictured tales, his mind was busy with the village girls, the ironic fact that he was to sleep in Alec Loden's bed. So Simon had refused to believe that he was Patrick. Not much point in saying you're not, I should think. That could only mean that Simon, in the face of all the evidence, refused to accept him. Why? He followed Eleanor downstairs, still wondering. Eleanor led him into a big, sunny sitting room where Bee was pouring sherry and Ruth was picking out a tune on a piano. "Would you like to hear me play?" Ruth asked inevitably. "No," Eleanor said. He wouldn't. "I'd forgotten how in love with heroin I used to be. It's just as well that I removed from him in time, or he might have become a fixation or something. I never liked that baby stuff on the walls. Ruth said. You never read, so you couldn't know anything about them, Eleanor said. We gave up using the nursery wing when the twins ceased to have a nanny, Bee said. It was a day's march to call the twins in the morning, Eleanor said, and as Ruth always needed calling several times, we had to move them into the normal family orbit. Delicate people need more sleep, Ruth said. Since when have you been delicate? Asked Eleanor. It's not that I'm delicate, but that Jane's more robust. Aren't you, Jane? She said, appealing to Jane, who sidled into the room, the hair at her temples still damp from her hasty ablutions. Simon is here, she said in a small voice, and crossed the room to stand near Bee, as if for reassurance. There was an instant of complete silence. In the moment of suspended animation, only Ruth moved. Ruth sat up and sparkled with anticipation. Then Bee's hand moved again and went on, filling the glasses. That is very nice, she said. We needn't keep luncheon back, after all. It was so beautifully done that Brat, knowing what he knew now, felt like applauding. Where is Simon? Eleanor asked casually. He was coming downstairs, Jane said. The door opened, and Simon Ashby came in. He paused a moment, looking across at Brat, before closing the door behind him. So you've come, he said. There was no emphasis on the words, no apparent emotion in the tone. He walked slowly across the room until he was standing face to face. He had abnormally clear grey eyes with a darker rim to the iris, but they had no expression in them, nor had his pale features any expression. He was so tightly strung, Brat thought, that if you plucked him with a finger, he would twang. And then, quite suddenly, the tightness went. He stood for a moment, searching Brat's face, and his own was suddenly slack. They won't have told you, he said, drawling a little, but I was prepared to deny with my last breath that you were Patrick. Now that I've seen you, I take all that back. Of course you are Patrick. He put out his hand. Welcome home. The stillness behind them broke in a flurry of movement and competing voices. There was a babble of mutual congratulation, of clinking glasses and laughter, disappointment at being done out of melodrama. She devoted her talents to wheedling a little more sherry into her glass than the sip that was the twins' allowance for health drinking. But Brat, drinking the golden liquid and thanking heaven that the moment was over, was puzzled. Why relief, he was thinking. What had Ashby expected? What had he been afraid of? He had denied the possibility of Brat's being Patrick. Had that been just a defense against hope, an insurance against ultimate disappointment? Had he said to himself, I won't believe that Patrick is alive, and so when it is proved that he isn't, I won't have hoped for nothing a moment ago, due merely to the realization that he was, after all, Patrick? It didn't fit. He watched Simon being the life of the party and wondered about him. A few moments ago, Ashby had been steeled to face something, and now it seemed he had been let off. That was it. That was what that sudden relief had been. The reaction of someone steeled to face the worst and suddenly reprieved. Why should he feel reprieved? He took the small puzzle into luncheon with him, and it lay at the back of his mind while he began conversation and answered their crowding questions. "You're in," gloated the voice inside him. "You're in. You're sitting as of right at the Ashby table, and they're all tickled to death about it." Well, perhaps not all. Jane, loyal to Simon, was a small, silent oasis in the talk. And it was not to be expected that Simon himself, for all his capitulation, was tickled to any great extent. But Bea, entirely radiant, and Eleanor melted moment by moment from conversational politeness to a frank interest. "But a Comanche bridle is a kind of twitch, isn't it?" "No, just a gag. The rope goes through the mouth the way a bit does. It's best for a led horse. He'll follow to lessen the pull." Ruth, having quite forgiven his lack of speculation about her looks, paid assiduous court to him, and she was the only one who called him Patrick. This became more noticeable as the meal went on, and her continual interjection of "Patrick," as she claimed his attention, contrasted with the other's half-conscious avoidance of the name. Brat wished that his soul followed her. If he had ever had a small sister, he would have liked her to be just like Jane. It annoyed him that he had difficulty in meeting Jane's eyes. It cost him the same effort to meet her regard with equanimity as it did to meet the eyes of the portrait behind her. The dining room was positively papered with portraits, and the one behind Jane was of William Ashby VII, wearing the uniform of the Westover Fencibles, in which he had proposed to resist. Brat had learned those portraits off by heart, sitting under the pagoda in Kew Gardens, and every time he lifted his eyes to those of William Ashby VII, he was plagued by the ridiculous notion that William knew all about the pagoda. One thing helped him enormously, however, in this first difficult meeting with the Ashbys. The tale he had to tell, as Loading had pointed out during that meal at the Green Man, was, except for its beginnings, true. It was the tale of his own life. On accord, avoided any reference to the events which had catapulted him into that life. The conversational ground he moved on was firm. There was need for neither sidestepping nor maneuver. Nor was there any need for him to mind his manners. And for that, too, Alec Loden had given thanks. It seemed that, short of a first-class and very strict nanny, there was no more rigorous training in the civilized class orphanage. "My God," Loading had said, "if I ever have any change from a round of drinks, I'll send it to that caravanserai of yours as a mark of my gratitude that you were not brought up in some genteel suburb. Gentility is practically ineradicable, my boy. And whatever Pat Ashby might conceivably do, it is quite inconceivable that he should ever stick out his little finger while he drank. Unlearn." Indeed, his unorthodoxy slightly disappointed Ruth, always on the lookout for the flamboyant. "You don't eat with your fork," she said, and when he looked puzzled, added, "the way they do in American pictures. They cut things up with their knives and forks, and then they change the fork over to their other hand and eat with it." "I don't chew gum either," he pointed out. "I wonder how that very elaborate method of dealing with their food arose," Bea said. "Perhaps knives were scarce in the Knives were far too useful to be scarce in a pioneer society," Simon said. "It's much more likely that they lived so long on hash that when they got things in slices, their instinct was to make hash of it as soon as possible." Brat thought, listening to them, how very English it all was. Here he was, back from the dead, and they were calmly discussing American table manners. There was no distance on the situation, as there would be in a transatlantic household. They avoided the "do you remember" theme as determinedly as Americans would have wallowed in it. Remembering his friends of the Lazy Y, he thought what a fine exhibition of limey snootiness this would be from the point of view of Pete and Hank and Lefty. But perhaps the happiness on Bee's face would have impressed even Lefty. "Do you smoke?" Bee asked when she had poured the coffee, and she pushed the cigarette box over to him. But Brat, who liked offered the contents to her. "I've given them up," Bee said. "I have a bank balance instead." So Brat offered the case to Eleanor. Eleanor paused with her fingers touching the cigarettes and bent forward to read something engraved on the inside of the case. "Brat Farrar," she said. "Who is that?" "Me," said Brat. "You? Oh, yes, Farrar, of course. But why Brat?" "I don't know." "Did they call you that? Brat, I mean?" "Yes." "Why Brat?" "I don't know. Because I was small, I guess." "Brat," Ruth said, delighted. "Do you mind if I call you Brat? Do you?" "No, The door opened, and Lana appeared to say that a young man had called to see Miss Ashby, and she had put him in the library. "Oh, what a nuisance," Bee said. "What does he want, do you know?" "He says he's a reporter," Lana said. "But he doesn't look like a reporter to me. Quite tidy and clean and polite." Lana's experience of the press, like Brat's knowledge of middle-class life, was derived solely from films. "Oh, no," Bee said, "not the press, not already. The Westover Times, he says he is." "Did he say why he had come?" "Come about Mr. Patrick, of course," Lana said, turning her thumb in Patrick's direction. "Oh, God," Simon groaned. "And the fatted calf not halfway down sooner or later." Bee drank the remains of her coffee. "Come on, Brat," she said, putting out her hand and pulling him to his feet. "We might as well go and get it over. You too, Simon." She led Brat out of the room, laughing at him, and still hand in hand with him. The warm friendliness of her clasp sent a rush of emotion to identify. It was like nothing he had so far experienced in life, and he was too busy with thoughts of the reporter to pause to analyze it. The library was the dark room at the back of the house where Bee kept her roll-top desk, her accounts, and her reference books. A small young man in a neat blue suit was puzzling over a stud book. At their entrance, he dropped the book and said in a rich Glasgow accent, "Miss Ashby, my name is McCallan. I'm working on the Westover Times. I'm awfully sorry about barging in like this, but I thought you'd have finished eating this long time." "Well, we began late, and I'm afraid we lingered over things," said Miss McCallan understandingly. "A very special occasion. I've no right to be spoiling it for you, but the first with the latest is my motto, and just this minute, you're the latest." "I suppose you mean my nephew's homecoming." "Just that. And how did you find out about it so soon, Mr. McCallan?" "One of my contacts heard about it in one of the Clare pubs." "A deplorable word," Bee said. "Pub?" Mr. McCallan said, puzzled. "No, contact." "Oh, well, one of my stooges, if you like that better," Mr. McCallan said agreeably. "Which of these young gentlemen is the returned prodigal, may I ask?" Bee introduced Brat. This had come back to Simon's face, but Brat, who had been around when Natsuko had cut his throat in the kitchen of his ex-wife's eating house and had witnessed the activities of the American press on that occasion, was entranced by this glimpse of news gathering in Britain. He answered the obvious questions put to him by Mr. McCallan and wondered if there would be any suggestion of a photograph. If so, he must get out of it somehow. But it was B who saved him from that. No photograph, said B. No, all the information he liked to ask for, but no photograph. Mr. McCallan accepted this, but reluctantly. The story of the missing twin won't be half so good with our photograph, he complained. You're not going to call it the missing twin, are you? B said. No, he's going to call it Back from the Dead, Simon said, speaking for the first time. His cool drawl fell on the room like a shadow. Mr. McCallan's pale blue eyes went to him, rested a moment on him consideringly, and then came back to B. I had thought of Sensation at Clare, he said, but I don't. A conservative organ. But I expect the Daily Clarion will do better. The Clarion, B said, a London paper. But I hope there is no question of that. This is an entirely local, an entirely family matter. So was that affair in Hilldrop Crescent, Mr. McCallan said. What affair? Crippen was the name. The world's press is composed of family affairs, Miss Ashby. But this is of no possible interest to anyone but us. 8 years ago, the Westover Times reported it quite incidentally. I know. I looked it up. A small paragraph at the bottom of page 3. I fail to see why my nephew's return should be of any more interest than his disappearance. It's the man bites dog affair over again. People go to their deaths every day, but the amount of people who come back from the dead is very small indeed, Miss Ashby. Coming back from the dead, in spite of the advances of modern science, is still a sensation. And that's why the Daily Clarion is going to be interested. But how should they hear about it? Hear about it? Mr. McCallan said, genuinely horrified. Miss Ashby, you mean you are going to send the story to the Clarion? Assuredly. Mr. McCallan, you mustn't. You simply, really must not. Listen, Miss Ashby, Mr. McCallan said patiently. I agreed about the no photographs prohibition, and I respect the agreement. I won't go sneaking around the countryside trying to snap the young gentleman unawares or anything like that. But you can't ask me to give up a scoop like this. Not a scoop of London. And as B, caught in the toils of her natural desire to be fair, hesitated, he added, even if I didn't send them the story, there's nothing to hinder a sub-editor lifting the story from the Westover Times and making it front-page news. You wouldn't be a scrap better off, and I'd have lost my chance of doing a bit of good for myself. Oh dear, B said, tacitly acknowledging that he was right. I suppose that means swarms of newspaper men from London. If it's the Clarion story, none of the rest will bother. And whoever they send down, you don't have to worry. They're all Balliol men, I understand. With which flip at the English press, Mr. McCallan looked round for his hat and made motions of departure. I'm very grateful to you, and to you, Mr. Ashby, for being so accommodating in the matter of information. I won't keep you any longer. May I offer you my congratulations on your happiness? For a second, the pale blue eyes rested in mild benevolence on Simon, and my thanks for your kindness. You're a long way from home, aren't you, Mr. McCallan? B said confidently. Home? Scotland. Oh, I see. How did you know I was Scots? Ah, my name, of course. Aye, it's a far cry to Glasgow, but this is just the long way round to London, so to speak. If I'm going to work on an English paper, it's as well to know something of the Aborigines, suggested B. Local conditions, I was going to say. Mr. McAllen said solemnly. Haven't you a car? Bea said, looking at the empty sweep in front of the door. I left it parked at the end of your drive there. I've never got used to sweeping up to strange houses as if I owned them. With which startling exhibition of modesty, the little man bowed. And my dears, that is part 5 of Brat Farrar by Josephine Tey. And next week at this time, for Tales and Cocktails, we'll get even deeper into the story. Thank you so much for being with me. Oh, I've loved it. I hope you have too. I hope you're beginning to love this book as much as I do. Goodbye for now. See you next week at 6 for Tales and Cocktails. Bye now.